So, number one, honouring God is the best thing we can do to remain in a strong position. In chapter 5, the Israelites have crossed the River Jordan, and the first thing that Joshua has the people do, the men anyway, is to have them circumcised. Now, this couldn't put them in a weaker position, really, physically speaking. The camp certainly wouldn't be able to fight in this condition. And so you have to ask what the thinking is there with Joshua. They've just entered a land that they know they're going to have to fight to win over. So why at this particular point does Joshua decide to have all the men circumcised? And I think it speaks volumes to Joshua's thinking, in that he saw it as being more important to honour God, to go back to the traditions of old before settling in this land. He risked being weak, weakening themselves, weakening the camp for the sake of honouring God, which really just shows us how important honouring God is. After all, it is God who wins our battles for us in the first place. We see this in the following chapter, chapter 6, when the Israelites defeat the city of Jericho. The walls of the city come tumbling down, not because of any great strategic planning on the part of the Israelites, but because they simply follow God's rather wacky orders in this case. God sometimes asks us to do some weird things, but often they're simply just to test our loyalty to him, to see if we're willing to honour him and appear foolish for his sake. And the Israelites certainly do that here. They march around the city 7 times and they're banging drums and horns, and they must have just looked ridiculous, quite frankly, but they follow what God has asked them to do to the letter, and as a result the walls come tumbling down. And again, like I say, this just shows that it's God who wins our battles for us, not us. If we go in with our own strength, if we try to do it alone, then we might win, we might achieve something, but it'll be harder. And I think if we honour God, if we do what he asks for us, our battles will be won, not by us, but by him, by his strength. For this reason, it's important that we do not lean upon our own understanding, but look to God to reveal the truth. In chapter 9, we read the story of how the Gibeonites trick the Israelites into making a treaty with them out of fear that they'll be wiped out otherwise. Now, the only reason that the Israelites fall for this trickery is that they don't consult God in the matter. They lean on their own understanding. They judge the situation based on what they see, and through their own understanding. They don't take it to God at any point. And I think if we've got a hard decision to make, a difficult decision, we need to take it to God. We need to ask him to reveal the truth to us so that we can make a decision based on what we hear from him. Number 4. It is important to remind ourselves of the promises that God has made to us. In chapter 14, Caleb reminds Joshua of the promise that was made to him by God through Moses, that if he was to drive out the Anakites, the hill country would be given to him and his people. And I think it's a valuable lesson, I think, to remind ourselves of the promises that God has made us, so that when they are fulfilled, we know the reasons for why things happen, so that we can give the glory back to God, really. If we forget the promise that God made to us, then when things happen, they can seem rather random, but keeping in mind that God was the one who promised those things in the first place, it always brings our focus back to him. Number 5, God keeps his promises. We see this time and time again in the Bible. Promises are constantly being fulfilled to characters such as Caleb. But we also see it again in chapter 17, when the daughters of Manasseh are given the inheritance that should have gone to Manasseh's sons had he had any sons, but because he didn't, the laws of the culture at that time would have meant that that inheritance would have passed on to another male heir, like the nearest in the family. But God kind of changed the culture by promising these daughters of Manasseh through Moses that they would actually be the ones to inherit the land. And that promise is fulfilled here in chapter 17, proving yet again that God always keeps his promises. Number 6, we never know what God is doing in someone's life. We might not know a person, but we can never assume just because of their circumstances or the situation that they live in that they can't or don't have a relationship with God. We see in chapter 2 that Rahab did have a relationship with God, and from all outward appearances there was no reason why she should. She lived in a city that didn't belong to the Israelites and was living in deep sin, but yet somehow she had a knowledge and a relationship with God, a knowledge of God and a relationship with him. So we never know what's going on in a person's life, how the Holy Spirit is moving in them and what God is doing with them. Number 7, if God tells us to do something, do it. The tribes of Israel consistently fail to dislodge certain people from the land, despite God's instruction for them to do so. This has terrible consequences for them, consequences that God could see, but which the Israelites seem to ignore, which is that if you keep those people in, you keep their practices in, you keep their worship of false gods in, and slowly and surely over the course of time these practices corrupted the Israelites and turned them away from God and from their true worship of him. Number 8, don't hang on to things that you don't need. Give them to people who can use it. We see an example of this in chapter 19 when the Simeonites inherit some land from the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Judah have more land than they can do anything with, to be honest. So rather than hoarding it and holding on to it, they give some of it away to people who can use it, who can do something with it. And I think there's a valuable lesson to be learned in that. Number 9, don't be afraid to challenge people in the right way to find out their motives before going to war with them. In chapter 22, the Gadites, Reubenites and half-tribe of Manasseh are allowed to go back to the land that was sworn to them before they crossed the Jordan. When they get there, they build an altar as a witness to the Lord. This really angers the rest of the Israelites, who think that they are going to be sacrificing on this altar and steering away from the religious practices that should be held in a certain part of the land within the promised land that's been marked out for it. So they jump to these conclusions and they're almost prepared to go to war with them. But we find out that the Gadites, the Reubenites and the half-tribe of Manasseh have actually built this altar as a reminder, as a symbol that they come from the same people as those on the other side of the Jordan, that they're not two separate groups of people but one, and that they worship the same God. So their motives are quite pure, and I think sometimes we can often jump to conclusions before just sitting down with people and just trying to find out what the motives are behind certain actions. So don't jump to conclusions, find out people's motives first. Number 10, establish traditions that will remind future generations of where they came from. When the Israelites swear to Joshua that they will follow only God and his ways, Joshua set up a large stone as a marker to commemorate their covenant, which they'd just made. And this is there to remind them and future generations of this covenant. And I think it's important to do other things in our own life to remind us of who it is we are following and why we are following him. And this is in many ways why we celebrate festivals like Easter and Christmas. We repeat the same actions year after year because we need to remind ourselves what it's all about. And I think this is a good example to follow.